Hey there, so today I've got another deck guide and breakdown for you, and it's going to be another Han deck. It's going to be Young Han Blue. I'm pretty into this new leader. I think he's got a lot of potential, and I know I did a mono red version of this, and I've been working out a blue version, and going to give you the full breakdown of what I'm doing with this deck. So first of all, why Han? Again, I think he's doing something fundamentally very powerful. He's cheating resources at a cost. There's a lot of units in this deck that benefit tremendously from coming out a turn early. The 2 damage being minimally impactful. I think this particular version, the blue version, might have the best target for cheating, and that's going to be Luke Skywalker. You see it on the thumbnail. It's kind of the core of this deck, playing a Luke for 6 resources as a 6/5 restore 3 that can dome tons of things, right? -6/-6, potentially -3/-3 as the fallback. Does a ton of work. Luke is an absolute monster and is the biggest draw by far to being in this deck, in this color pair with the new Han. But let's talk about a few of the other ones too, right? Obi-Wan, not always the most impressive card, but coming down a turn early, you would think 4/4 Sentinel, not amazing, but his on-death trigger, quite powerful, especially when you're playing to the board early, as this deck is going to do. Redemption, again, why wait till 8 when you can just play it for 7? You still get the massive Space Sentinel. The thing was going to dome itself anyway to heal you. So yeah, you can heal 2 less, but you're getting it down a whole turn earlier. Chewbacca, a complete dud of a card outside of this deck, I think. But, you know, at 7 resources, coming down as a 6/8 because of the grit, and then immediately playing Takedown is a very good follow-up to the Luke Skywalker turn. These are all good cards. There's a few other things to do with blue that we'll talk about when we go into the full card-by-card breakdown. I will point out that I'm not really playing this as a Force deck. I'm not really digging into the Force synergy stuff. There are a lot of Force units in this deck, but we're not playing the payoffs outside of Force Throw, which I like to put in basically every deck that can play it. So yeah, that's not one of the draws for me in blue, although at the end I will talk about the Force package and other ways to use this deck. All right, so here's the full list. There will also be a sideboard slide later on. I'm going to go break this down now bit by bit, kind of talk about all the cards that oh, let me get rid of that light. All right, talk about all the cards that we'll be playing and kind of what to do with them. So first off, the early units. So this is like a pretty core version of like the blue-red hero early units. We go with the Restored Arc and the A-Wing. They're just good space units. It's important to have space right now. You're going to be playing against Sabines. You're going to be playing against people playing like the TIE Phantom. You need to be able to interact early and often. Sabine unit, still one of the best 2-drops in the game. We've got Yoda. He's fantastic. We're playing Force Throw, so he's our cheapest enabler for that. He's also built-in card advantage, built-in restore. Concord Dawn is actually a pretty interesting card because even if you have to cheat it out for 2 resources, on defense it still trades with like things like A-Wing and Kylo's TIE Interceptor. So your opponent starts in space as an aggro deck. You can just drop this. They'll still mostly just need to trade unit for unit. And then Cassian doubles as both like one of your better turn 1 plays as a 3/3, right? He's just Battlefield Marine, and one of your better later game plays, and also just a really solid turn 2 play as a 3/5. So he kind of fills in all our roles there. Early in the game, we're not often cheating our resources. Like there's not like outside of like turn 1 Cassian or turn 1 Concord Dawn, and in some cases a turn 1 Yoda. We're mostly just looking to play a regular 2-drop, right? The best plays will just be one of the actual 2s or a Cassian. That's generally how you want to start the game. And turn 2 as well, we're mostly just looking to play a 3-drop on that turn. There are cases where if you kept a very 2-drop heavy hand, you can go double unit on the second turn with a 2-drop and a 2-drop played as a 1-drop. But early on, we're not trying to cheat out too much. We do have right here, when we talk about the mid-game units, K2 is our only 4-drop that can come down on the 3-resource turn. It's an okay play to play him as a 4-2. He's kind of core in the discard plan of this deck, which will include him, Pillage, and Force Throw. And he's just a pretty good beater. It does give us some much needed aggression into controlling strategies. Ray, actually a good deck for Ray, right? So Ray can come down on the 4 as a 4-drop, is a 4/5 with 2 damage on her, but she has built-in healing for herself, so she can attack as a 4/7 the following turn. She fills that Kanan slot in this deck. I don't love Kanan in this deck, especially because I'm not playing much Force payoff in this deck. If you were building with more Force payoffs, you might also want to include Kanan, but I don't think he's particularly impressive as a 3-drop. When he comes down as a 4/3, I'd rather just play like something like a Baze Malbus at that point, who would be a 4/3 Sentinel. So Ray fills that like chunky mid-range unit, and I think she just does it a bit better than Kanan would in this deck. And then we got Poe, who's an absolute bomb. Now he comes down early with only 4 health. Now, when you do that, he's often easy to answer. Well, not easy, just like he can be answered, but usually with something that also costs around 4. And if he's not immediately answered, poses huge problems for your opponent. He's one of the better cards you can play into a Sabine unit on this in Sabine deck on this turn, because he represents a kill into a Dark-Sabered Sabine, for instance, or a kill into like a Sabine plus the 2 damage thrown at something. So he often will need to eat an ambush from your opponent on that turn, or a trade, in which case he prevents a bunch of damage from Sabine, and that can be a tough matchup in this deck. We do have a lot of Restore, as you've seen, between, well, not in the main deck, actually. I board into a lot of healing, but there are some removal cards in this deck. There's a little bit of Restore. There's some Sentinel, but the Sabine matchup can be tough in the main deck configuration. We got Obi-Wan, who we talked about in the beginning. Obi-Wan early is actually really strong. I don't love him as a 6-drop, but I think he kind of really does well as a 5-drop with that 2 damage, because your opponent still has to trade with him. He comes down earlier. He's able to buff something early in the game. He maintains your board presence. He has built-in card advantage if we're able to get that experience onto a Force unit, which I really like. This deck does grind really well with the card advantage. And then Wrecker. So Wrecker is odd here, and I understand if you might not want to include it, because we're going above the curve substantially, right? We're going into Lukes, we're going into Chewbacca's and Redemptions and Crate Dragons. So there's a lot of matchups where you're not going to want to blow up your own resources. However, there are matchups where Wrecker's an absolute lifesaver. He's good against aggressive decks, and sometimes you just have to do it. You're not going to get into your late game if you're just dead, and Wrecker can help you not be dead. I think he's worth a couple slots because of that, and you also just need to remember you don't have to blow up your own resources. You can just play him as a 7/4 for 5 or a 7/6 for 6, which is sometimes okay, especially into control decks. Like, just here, another giant thing you have to deal with. It's okay sometimes. But yeah, I think it also works out just fine to dome something, prolong the game a bit, and then, you can't Luke next turn. That's fine. You'll Luke the following turn. But you're going to make it to the following turn primarily because Wrecker helped get you there. And then the finishers. So Luke is the biggest, baddest guy in this deck. Him coming down early is absolute fantastic. He generates extreme value. The Restore helps us a lot against aggro. He can come down early enough against aggressive decks to actually matter, right? He can come down, kill things into Boba, like 7 Fleet Defender, like really obnoxious units. He can even kill a Fett's Fire Spray on that turn if you're able to set it up right. Luke, monster. Redemption, also monster. And coming down to turn early is also really important against aggressive decks, right? Sometimes you don't make it to 8 resources against Sabine, but often you can make it to 7, and this can still come for 7 resources, still heal you for 6 immediately and leave behind a 6/1 Sentinel in space. And because of that, it does really well. Chewbacca, Also, right, like him following up into Luke, right? Luke kills something, leaves behind a big unit. Chewbacca kills something, leaves behind a big unit. These are good plays. Chewbacca also has Smuggle, which against like attrition-based decks can just be a built-in card advantage. And then Crate, this is our anti-control finisher. It comes down to turn earlier. Of course, like everything up here coming down to turn early. These guys all have tons of health, so it's not like that 2 damage is doing much. So the Crate coming early can really slam the door against some strategies, especially if they've had to deal with a bunch of these other big things coming down early. All right, some interaction. So Force Throw and Pillage, we'll talk about that together. That's built-in discard. I'll talk a bit more about the actual discard stuff in general a bit later, but fantastic core to this deck between Force Throw, Pillage, K2, and sometimes Poe also has the incidental discard. Really to try to strip an opponent's hand to 0 so that you can just like start dropping haymakers and force them into top deck mode. Force Throw obviously can also be turned on in this deck pretty easily. It only costs 1, so even like turn 2, you play Yoda with the 2 damage, and then you can get a sneak in a Force Throw there. That can be a really strong play. The other 4 cards, 2 Takedown, 1 Fell the Dragon, 1 Rival's Fall. This is just like a removal package. It's pretty flexible. You can change this up. It's how I've opted in the current state of this deck. I think we want the takedowns a little more because early on we don't want to get run over, and we do have big things that can generally deal with other big things later, which is why I'm only on like 1 Fell, 1 Rival's Fall. But in general, this is pretty flexible. And there's going to be a bunch of other options that I'll put in the sideboard here in a moment. So yeah, sideboard currently is very anti-aggro or with some anti-boba stuff, right? Make an opening at its best against like 7th Fleet Defender and TIE Phantoms, although decent against Sabine sometimes. Open Fire is kind of the core card against Sabine often, so I've put in 3 in the sideboard. Vigilance as well. A good card into aggressive decks, into shielded units to be able to kill and heal. Base Malbus, I talked about him before. I think as a 3-cost 4/3 Sentinel, it's okay, right? It's Echo-based Defender. It's not a amazing card, but he can also double as like a 2/5 Sentinel for 4, as long as you have that initiative. And I think the deck, like I said, can struggle sometimes in the early turns against aggression, especially against something like a Dark-Sabered Sabine, and often we need to chunk it twice in order to survive, so Base being able to protect some damage and maybe following up with something like a Wrecker or a Takedown can put the hammer on that Dark-Sabered Sabine. I put in the last Crate Dragon too for the like long games, like the control matchups. All right, so we'll do a little bit of strategy stuff for this deck. Han flip turn, so it's a big deal in general, right? You need to be aware that if you flip Han before you play anything and Han instantly dies, then you're not going to be able to cheat anything that turn. So it's very important that if you want to play something like a Wrecker or an Obi-Wan, which you can only play with the cheated resource, that you plan accordingly. Wrecker is a tough one on this turn because if you play him before you flip Han, you can no longer flip Han. Now, sometimes you just have to do it, but just keep that in mind. Much better to flip Han and then play Wrecker if you have the option. Obi-Wan, on the other hand, is pretty nice to play before you flip Han because he built-in protects Han. So these are kind of the 6 drops that you're looking at playing on this turn. But a lot of other options on this turn involve playing wide, right? Playing multiple units, getting Han in play, and then you can play like a 3-drop plus a 3-drop, theoretically, and a 2-drop, right? You can play like a 3, and a 2. Yoda, Cassian, A-Wing, right? That all can come down on the same turn. You can, a lot of times you want to just like prevent damage on this turn because your follow-up turn is the Luke turn. So things like Takedown plus a 2-drop can work, or Takedown plus a Force Throw, or Pillage plus a Force Throw to just really go after the hand. You get 3 cards out of their hand that turn, and hopefully start the next turn with your Han in play so that you can immediately play the Luke. All right, the 6 resource turn. So this one's also important. So one very important sequencing thing that happens with this deck is you played Han on the 5 resource turn. You did something cool, and you're going into your next turn on 6 resources, and Han's in play. What do? Do you immediately jam Luke? What if you wanted the 6/6 trigger, and you have something else that maybe you can trade off? So you can get greedy and try to go for that. The problem here sometimes is that if you don't immediately slam that Luke, and your Han leader is defeated, you can no longer play Luke that turn because your leader would go back into the leader zone and it'll be exhausted and you are now stuck on that 6 resources. So a lot of times, if you have a target for the Luke, I wouldn't even chance it. Just kill something, kill that 7th Fleet Defender, let them play the Fire Spray or something, right? Don't worry about that. You're going to have this 6/5 Restore 3 in play that just killed something. You still have your Han leader in play at this point, and you're cooking, right? You can go into your next turn with 7 resources. You might even be able to play a second Luke or a cheated Chewbacca or a cheated Redemption. So getting the Luke into play is sometimes just like with the -3/-3 trigger instead of the -6/-6 is still worthy, and you just need to be aware that if like Luke has to be played this turn and you're gonna lose if you don't do it, that try not to be too greedy and try not to like mess around because your Han can be defeated and then you're stuck on that 6 resources. All right, discard plan. So if you've seen my Churret video, which was also pretty recent, it's the exact same core here. Actually, I wasn't playing Poe and Churret, so the Force Throw, Pillage, K2 are all the same core. It's a powerful core of cards that work together to get your opponent's hand to 0 around turn 5. And when you do that, you enter this top deck situation, and this deck plays off the top deck pretty well because we've got a lot of haymakers that are all coming down early. And not to mention, a lot of these cards generate 2-for-1 value, so you might not even be in top deck mode yourself. So against decks that give you the opening to do this, I very much like to capitalize on that. I do want to reiterate that discard on its own is not enough to beat control decks, because everyone's drawing 2 a turn, and control decks have tons of 2-for-1 value built into them as well, right? They've got barrages, Vaders if they're playing green. They've got like enticing reward out of yellow, ambush units that can 2-for-1, super laser blast that can really catch up, right? But this card works decently, especially the later in the curve that these decks are going, because they have to keep resourcing. So you're going to hit that hand. And remember, the most important card in their hand is the last one you discard. So the mass discard is very important. I don't like splashing discard. Like, I don't just slam pillages in my deck and hope that it's going to work. It really is about critical mass. It's about getting the last card out of their hand so that they start top decking. So these cards all do that really well. It's not a strategy you can really employ against Sabine, but it often is a strategy you can employ against Boba, because Boba likes to dump its hand with the readying resources. Tends to be a bit hand light sometimes, and because of this, you can really capitalize on their flip turn. You can sometimes get 3 cards out of their hand and make it so that they can't even spend any resources or most of the resources that turn, and you can follow up into your 6 resource turn, which again is your Luke turn. And if a Boba deck is top decking into your Luke turn, they might just not have a chance anymore. So this card can work against them as long as they're not completely running you over in the early game. And as such, I think it's a powerful core to this deck. But again, it needs to be backed up with aggression, especially against control decks. Against Boba, you're going to win the end game if they're not able to like chain fire sprays or stuff like that. But against control decks, you can discard all you want, but you need to actually putting them on a clock or they will draw out of it eventually. And by the same token, so card advantage on the bottom row there, it's all the discard stuff, but we've also got some built-in card advantage and card draw, right? Cassian out of the resource row, and Chewbacca for that matter, although Chewbacca's smuggle is extremely expensive and not that impactful. Yoda with the built-in draw, Obi-Wan can sometimes get us draw. You know, we've got 2-for-1 units in Luke as well. So the deck can grind. It might not be that aggressive, but it can last a long time. It can keep presenting threats through sheer card advantage. And then, you know, against games that are really trying to attrition you out, it is going up to Crate Dragon, and that can help close out games. All right. just to wrap up here, some other considerations. So I told you I would talk a bit about the Force package. So 4 of these cards, Mystic Reflection, Jedi Lightsaber, Kanan, and Forces with Me, are all cards that work together well in a Force package. I've opted away from that because the leader is not a Force unit, like Chirrut or Rey, and I think it's a little more difficult to rely on these cards in a deck like that. Forces with Me especially is an expensive card, so it's harder to squeeze into a curve the way you can with Force Throw. And Jedi Lightsaber as well. I don't think we really need to go tall in this deck. I think our units do that on their own. We don't need to start buffing them. Like, I'd rather just, go up the curve with big units as opposed to doubling down on some of them. Mystic Reflection is a nice card. I play Make an Opening in this deck to kind of fill that role. Again, I don't love the situational nature of it in this deck because it's harder to trigger it as opposed to something like Chirrut, which has the built-in immunity and the cheap Force tag on the leader. As such, I've opted away from it, but I don't think it's unreasonable to squeeze this package in and play this deck a little differently. It would just require a little bit of a makeover. I would want the Kanan in most likely to get the density of Force units up. I'd probably opt for the Forces with Me as the first card from here that I would add in addition to Kanan, and maybe I'd play like 1 or 2 Jedi Lightsabers. Mystic Reflection could squeeze in as well. It is a lot of cards. It's a big package. You're going to need to look at some of the mid-range units to replace with Kanan. It might mean trimming on Rey, which I know is a Force unit. It's just a more expensive one. It might mean trimming on something like Wrecker or Poe. Force with Me is very powerful. It's just, I don't love getting stuck with a bunch of situational cards in my hand when I don't need to. A few of the other things here, Carabas. So I like this card in general in Han, right? He's got the built-in way to deal 2 damage to a unit. It's just, as I've played more and more with this, it didn't feel great. Like, again, I just want to curve out with units for the most part. Dealing 3 to things, like most of our units can do that on their own. I'd rather just be bashing units into things as opposed to playing Carabas. Although, one of the more impactful things you can do with Carabas is something like a turn 2, playing a 2-drop for 1, like an A-Wing or a Restored Arc, and then immediately Carabasting an opponent's 2-drop, dealing 3 to it. That's a pretty strong play. It's the one place I really kind of do miss Carabas. But overall, I opted for other removal and just like playing more units that I can play early on, and then playing open fires out of the sideboard against Sabine. Tech is a grindy card. Now, I showed you earlier that this deck does grind pretty well, but if you wanted to throw in like 1 tech just to have that, I wouldn't fault you. And lastly, Guerrilla Attack Pod is a way to add a little bit of aggression to this deck, especially against control decks. It does sometimes just, play a little fair. Like, it just unit without like really pressuring your opponent. A lot of the units we play are reactive, like Luke, Chewbacca, Redemption, Wrecker. Although Wrecker is enormous, but they are reactive stuff. A lot of their value comes from being able to take something out or heal. And there's certain decks where that is not very valuable. Now, they're all still presenting big threats, and like we're going to Crate Dragon. That's really like discard plus Crate Dragon. But Guerrilla Attack Pod, it can come down as a 5 cost at 6/4. Sometimes that's readied as well. That can be a pretty big deal, and I think is a thing to consider. Again, it would likely go somewhere in like that Wrecker slot. We can't have too much big beef, but I think it's a very reasonable include. All right, that's what I got. It's a bit of a shorter one. I think this deck is very good. I'll keep working on it. This is a blueprint. It is not a finished product right now. I just wanted to get this out there, get your thoughts on it, and see what people think. Of course, I always like blue-red, right? Chirrut's a big Chirrut fan. This is another blue-red hero deck that like dabbles with the Force stuff. Goes into like the big blue finishers out of hero. So it's a fun deck to play. I think it's quite powerful. Would love to hear your thoughts on it. So again, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Please subscribe. And until next time, take care.